Hello everyone, we are today here at the Military History Museum of the Bundeswehr in Dresden with the curator Jens Wehner.
Hello.
And we talk about gun concepts specifically for German and Soviet tanks in the Second World War around 1941 or 1940 depending on it. So up here we have the 75mm of the Germans with a barrel length of 24. So basically the caliber length times 24 is the length of the barrel. With a short barrel, in German it was also called Stummel. And here we have the Soviet F-34 76.2 millimeters with a barrel length of about 41.5. So one could say, if you look at 1941, so in a way you could say, well, the Soviets were clearly ahead because they went with a long barrel 76 millimeter, whereas the Germans still used the short barrel one. But is this correct, or?
In the end, I would say yes, because you can see that after 41, the Germans also made their barrels longer, especially the 75, which, as you mentioned, had a L24, and in 43 we had already the 48 caliber length, meaning they doubled their length of the barrel in the usual Panzer IV, not to mention the Panzer.
70,
which had a caliber length of 70. So I would say in the end the Soviets were right for 41 when they had the longer barrel.
And we should also mention, because somebody probably will mention it, at one point the Panzer IV had also L43. I think there was an intermediate length as well, for a short while. Yeah. So just for the specialists out there.
I was just mentioned the end point of the development for the Panzer IV.
But you know the comment section, you know.
I know the comment section.
So, but previously, I mean, what is very important here, actually, I think to mention, because I recently read this in Saloga, this is basically a version to a certain degree of the CIS-3, which is often portrayed as an anti-tank gun, but he points out that the CIS-2, the 57mm, was actually an anti-tank gun, and this was still a general purpose gun, basically, the 76. Whereas this, to a certain degree, was also a general purpose gun. So one could say the Soviets had just a better general purpose gun?
At least they had in mind a general purpose gun, while the Germans at this time, at least for the tanks, had specialist guns. And I think this is not so special German. This is, I would say, more common for the 30s. If you think about British developments, or think also about Soviet developments of the 30s, like the T-35, which had 3 different guns. And there were a shorter one with a bigger caliber to fight for the infantry, and there was a longer with a smaller caliber to fight the enemy tanks. And I think this was a common thinking of the 30s in tank armament, in tank guns, which was still the case for the Germans in 41.
And also, for instance, with the British, with the Churchill 1, you have also a short, I think 3-inch howitzer, but with the Churchill 3, which basically were developed at the same time. He has, I think, a 57mm gun, which is also rather not so long, but it's more of an anti-tank gun. And that is actually an error I made many years ago when I talked with David Willie at the Tank Museum, where I basically said the Germans went with a universal tank already in the beginning, where my mind completely set out. I forgot this was a Panzer III with more of an anti-tank version, and the Panzer IV with more of an anti-infantry version. Although I should mention, in the Heeresdruckvorschrift 470/7, which I translated with Christoph Berg's military aviation history, it is actually mentioned, and it is on the medium company, so it's for the Panzer IV with the short barrel gun. They particularly mention you can also shoot especially tanks with this gun. So it's made for this as well, but because that was quite interesting. So some people read this, what we wrote in what we translated, we didn't write it, we translated it, and said, okay, so this actually kind of disproves the notion that the Panzer IV, the early one, was a support for the infantry. But then I thought as well, it's for a certain time, but then I looked at the ammo layout, and the ammo layout is clearly in favor for high explosive shells and not for armor-piercing shells. And this is also a problem where you have to look at, like, at the longer development, at certain points. You can say it's a short barrel gun. Nowadays you say it's low velocity and can't kill tanks, but it's still 75. And tank armor, depending on the time, against the Soviets, of course, it's not gonna work with their medium and heavy tanks, but against the light tanks, it's completely fine.
I think, what is a light tank? I mean, the whole tank development in the 30s and 40s is very dynamic. So if you look at the tanks that were built, let's say in the mid of the 30s and in the mid of the 40s, so 10 years, it's really huge what happened, in my opinion. Yeah, if you look at the Panda, which is let's say a medium tank by the standards of 45 or afterwards, it would be a really heavy tank in the 30s. And if you compare it with other times, let's say the Cold War, and you compare tanks of the 80s with tanks of the 70s, I would say the differences are not so big as from the mid of 30s to the end of the 40s. So you see, you have a huge development, and what's fine for 1939, or at least they anticipated in 1939, it's still okay to fight with a 75mm short-barreled gun enemy tanks, because they only have an armor of, let's say, 1 or 2 inch. It's not fine for 1943 or 44.
Yeah, I mean, Ralf Raths recently made a quite interesting meme. Ralf Raths is director of the German Panzermuseum, like where he put like this guy in the disco who is completely shocked because he wrote, when you realize that the turret of the Königssieger is 2.5 times the weight of a Panzer I. It's just, you see the Panzer I, basically a complete tank, and 2.5 times just for the turret of the Königssieger, which came basically what you mentioned in the mid-30s and the mid-40s. And you see this change also with like in the Panzer II was built with the 20mm autocannon for anti-tank purposes. And you also see some people mention, okay, in Truppenführung, the German, some say a Bible of Art of War, it's mentioned that the anti-aircraft guns should also be used for anti-tank purposes. And they did the testing, and they tested with the 20mm and with 3.7 at one point, as Jens points out, but not with the 8.8mm at that point. Because at that point, nobody thinks that you would need that huge of a gun to fight tanks. And then you see immediately how through the war and some other aspects change. Of course, the 88mm gun got an armor-piercing shell, but this was for anti-bunker action actually, initially.
Yeah, it's also with the Soviets, with the KV-2, who had a big howitzer, 152mm, I think, to crack bunkers mostly, and not to fight enemy tanks also. That's also the reason why it's a howitzer and not a cannon on it. And so I think we have really to keep in mind that sometimes to write a manual can take longer than the development of the technology can advance over some years or so. So maybe they were thinking in, I don't know, in the relations of 1934 or 35 when they were writing this, or maybe 39 or so. But especially in World War II, the tank development really was very dynamic. And I would say it's hard to anticipate what's right and what's wrong for this. And if you look at the F-34, so this tank cannon in the T-34, you also have to keep in mind that the T-34 for this time had really a powerful engine with roughly 500 horsepower. And so, of course, it could bear a huger cannon than the other tanks from the same mass, like the Panzer IV also. This also plays a role, how fast the tank can be and so on. You have to balance the whole technical system. And if you have a stronger engine in the tank, you can also build a stronger armor and a stronger base of the whole tank and a stronger chassis. And so also your tank cannon will be maybe stronger if you can.
And the previous guns in the T-34, I think, were also bit shorter barrel, had a shorter barrel length
Yeah,
as well, I think.
yeah. Actually, the first one, the L11, had only roughly 30 barrel length.
So it was way closer to this one.
Yeah, it was way closer to this one. And then they saw, okay, we can put in also a longer gun, and we use this gun. So, and they put it in. And so you see, actually, as far as I have read from documents at Tank Archives and so on, and Peter Samsonov mentioned, they tried to fit the T-34 with different guns. Like, for instance, the 57mm gun, which wasn't chosen in 1940 or 1941, but at the end of 1941 there was actually a small batch of T-34 with 57mm guns.
So with specifically the anti-tank gun.
Yeah, so it was, but this was not, I think, to make a new batch, a new series of T-34. Maybe it was because of a lack of those guns. I don't know why it was, but at least they built a batch of a little bit amount of such 57mm guns into the T-34. So this would also be possible. And they also tested more guns that were available or should be available in the future. And we know later in the war, it turned out that the T-34 could also bear a bigger gun, like the 8.5 centimeter gun or the 85mm gun. And of course, the T-34 was redesigned for this, especially the tower, the turret. But in the end, it turned out also this tank had some reserves left because it had a similar chassis, a similar engine, and it could also bear the bigger gun. So you see, even this was not the limit at this time.
Yeah. So basically you can see that the T-34 was able to be upgraded. The Panzer IV to a certain degree, whereas with the Panzer III was basically, I mean, it started with a 37mm gun, and then the 50 L60 was no, not the latest. The latest was actually this gun again. So basically then the Panzer III and Panzer IV switched roles. Then they switched to that. And what I've actually found interesting, in one document, I will probably put that down, they actually mentioned that this gun had a certain benefit actually against the longer barreled one.
And that was?
Actually, I remember two now. Now one was I didn't know. One is for the fighting in Stalingrad, etc., where of course your shorter barreled gun is of benefit, but they also mentioned another one. And it's actually inherent in the design.
I think it's had a better high explosive.
I don't know if that could be, but the thing is, since you have the trajectory is more steep, so it's better for indirect firing or for firing over friendly infantry.
Okay, I
see. They specifically mentioned this, and this is also the irony because the Sturmgeschütze, the assault artillery or the assault guns, and from the assault artillery branch were meant for supporting the infantry. Yet they then got the long-barreled one and then actually turned into tank destroyers.
Interesting, yeah.
And so you see actually that the short-barreled gun was intentionally designed to support infantry or to be a support gun, also likely due to the high trajectory. Because usually you think, yeah, high trajectory means it's usually harder to hit because precision goes down. The gunner has to be more precise. I mean, some probably you might know from games like War Thunder, where it's to a certain degree is modeled. Then you actually see, okay, the bracket goes up in the aiming reticle, and well, if you're under fire in real life, I think it's even a bit more problematic, although you're better trained at that point. But I found this quite interesting to see, oh, somebody says, no, wait. And then I say, yeah, it actually makes sense. So sometimes a gun...
I just want to add that I think this is especially true for the Sturmgeschütz, which has a lower height. And so it's next to the infantry more than the Panzer IV maybe.
That's even more important, yeah.
And this has the role to give the infantry some support. And of course, this support will be mostly with high explosive grenades. And so, makes absolutely sense.
So, and here you can see to a certain degree that sometimes what you think, oh, that's a weak gun, actually it really depends on the situation. And And as often pointed out, tank-to-tank combat was not regular, and although the Soviets and the Germans to a certain degree built a lot of tanks, it was still, compared to how much infantry was out there and how much anti-tank guns, which you would also ideally fight with that, is quite a difference. So this is the problem with computer games.
And I also find in documents that in 1941, in the first battles at the Soviet Union, German Sturmgeschütz with those short-barreled guns actually at least disabled, let's say it like this, heavy Soviet tanks like the KV also, because they outmaneuvered them and shot on them on the flanks, on the sides, and the tracks were destructed by the shots and so on. So this was possible, and also this cannon could shot a heat at some point, I think, and the heat, of course, was also able to burn through the armor of any tank at this time, I think.
Yeah, and I assume, I don't think for the 50mm you could have heat. I know for the 37mm, for the pack gun, they made the over caliber. So I think 75mm was probably at that point the minimum you needed for a heat round.
Yeah, it's said it's 2 times or 3 times the caliber you have, it's the heat. So, yeah.
So the penetration?
The penetration, yeah.
Ah, okay, yeah.
It's but this is, yeah, it really depends on the heat. It's also a formula like this for the projectiles with kinetic energy, but this is mostly also not true, because the technology in itself is mostly more complicated than such a formula, but it's set like this.
Okay. Anything else to add here?
Yeah, I would say in the long term, maybe this cannon was a first step, at least in the T-34, not in the KV-1, but in the T-34 for the main battle tank we see today.
Yeah, the main battle tank is a whole new discussion. I think I will talk
I don't want to open it now. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Jens.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Thank you for watching, and thank you to the Military History Museum of the Bundeswehr in Dresden for inviting me. Big thanks to my Patreon and subscriber supporters for making trips like this possible. Thank you for watching, and see you next time. Bye.
Bye.